Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about Doctor Strange from 1978. This is, of course, the 1978 TV movie and or backdoor pilot for a Doctor Strange TV show that didn't happen, not the new movie that I'll be reviewing next. This kind of represents how comic books were treated in terms of their adaptations in movies or TV before more recently. They weren't treated very well. However, this version of a comic book character got treated probably better than most, although it's not a good movie, or in the grand scheme of things, and especially how we treat comic books and adaptations now, that's fairly laughable. But the guy who was really behind this, Philip I'm not sure, actually kind of cared, and although the actual results of this don't show that whatsoever, did actually try to make kind of an odder Marvel Comics character. It wasn't like anyone was sitting around going like, hey, let's make a Doctor Strange TV show, it's the new hot property. So there should be some credit to him and CBS for actually attempting something like this. It's different when you're a movie studio and you have several billion-dollar movies and you have some clout to burn on. This is a lot riskier of an idea and, you know, no continuity and all that stuff. And it is kind of an odd one, and why they chose to do this. Now, this was coming off of the success of CBS's relationship with Marvel Comics. At the time, they had two TV shows on the air, The Incredible Hulk, which of course was very successful with Bill Bixby and Lou Ferrigno, and a Spider-Man show, which is like really awful. And then they had these two Captain America TV movies. And so they decided the next character was Doctor Strange. But they thought that this could become interesting and different TV show, as it was using mysticism, which was a lot bigger in the 70s, and that they thought this could work as a show. And Doctor Strange as a backdoor pilot, I kind of understand what the premise was kind of going to be. And it's kind of a softer way to do a comic book adaptation, because instead of having in the comics where Doctor Strange just becomes, you know, the Sorcerer Supreme and is a superhero at a certain point, in this, he can be a superhero and also a doctor. Oh, so it's like half superhero show, half doctor show. So that's less risky in a way, I guess, and way less interesting. So I guess he was gonna like help people with their health insurance, but mystically or something, or overcharge them probably. That was kind of the impression I get from this TV movie. It was a different hero and it was a different TV show for the time. It was also going to end up being not really that much of an interesting TV show. It was trying to be kind of half a traditional TV show and half like mysticism that his character knows so well. I had actually seen this before, because in the 90s on the Sci-Fi Channel, I saw this was airing on the TV Guide during the day when I was at school and my dad was at work, and my dad is a huge Doctor Strange fan. I said, hey, we should at least have seen this because it's the Doctor Strange movie, and we watched it, and I remember it being bad, and watching it again, it continues to be bad, but I also sort of forgot how super boring it is. It's kind of like an interesting idea for a 70s TV show, except with kind of most of the acting being lifeless, and only a few parts that are cool, with an interesting synth score, and so many parts that are so boring. I'm not sure if I fell asleep or was still watching this TV movie at certain points. In Hell, the Nameless One wants to threaten the transition of powers between the Sorcerer Supreme, so he sends Morgan Le Fay, played by Jessica Walters, who most people know from Arrested Development, to stop that from happening, as the Sorcerer Supreme knows he needs to transition his powers into Doctor Strange. Now, Doctor Strange, who is a doctor in psychology, though I believe he was a surgeon in the comics, but then after Morgan Le Fay comes to Earth and has a fight with the present Sorcerer Supreme before he transitions his powers to Doctor Strange, have a fight, and she possesses Clea Lake and makes her throw the Sorcerer Supreme off a bridge, although that's really not a big a deal because he can just like repair himself with his magic powers, but it totally freaks Clea out and messes her up mentally, and so she has to go to the hospital where she meets Dr. Stephen Strange. Dr. Strange is trying to help her, and then the Sorcerer Supreme guy comes and talks to him and tries to train him to be the new Sorcerer Supreme and introduces him to his friend Wong, and hopefully get Clea Lake's mind back and stop Morgan Le Fay from stopping the transition of powers between them. Doctor Strange, which is spelled Dr. not the full doctor, which the new movie spelled it out. This always kind of reminds me of when major studios had faith in comic books. When you talk about a comic book movie, you'd always talk about it as a product that would be less than, because it would be made as something like this. And this is something you'd see as a tape at a comic book convention. There'd always be a guy who'd have tons of tapes of pilots and series that didn't run that long of comic book shows and movies that were mostly crappy, and he'd have playing at his little booth at the convention. That's where I saw like the Roger Corman Fantastic Four. And I remember seeing this, but it wasn't until the Sci-Fi Channel, which the Sci-Fi Channel played like in USA would play all this stuff, all the Spider-Man TV show, the Captain America TV movies, which I never saw because those looked real bad, and this occasionally. I don't think this is as bad as the Spider-Man show, which is pretty horrendous, but I will give it some credit. This is the first time a Marvel supervillain had been portrayed in a TV show or movie or anything that wasn't animation with Morgan Le Fay as Jessica Walters. The Hulk really didn't fight supervillains. He just fought like bullies in town and loneliness and existentialism. I mean, really, like, he didn't fight supervillains until like Kingpin in like the TV movie. I think it's The Trial of the Incredible Hulk. But at this time, they didn't do that. And Spider-Man just fought ninjas and people who were trying to kidnap a building or something. I really don't remember that show, and it's probably best I don't. But they didn't, from what I've read, Morgan Le Fay was the first time Marvel supervillain had been portrayed by an actor before, which is kind of interesting. So it's actually probably closer to the comic book than any of the other CBS things, to my understanding, which is something. They actually attempted to do that. And Stan Lee, actually, who was an advisor on this, Stan Lee didn't create this necessarily. It's more of a Steve Ditko creation, and obviously he wasn't going to help. Stan Lee was very happy with it. Most of the people thought the guy who directed it actually really cared and wanted this to be successful. Unfortunately, this aired against an episode of Roots. Actually, it's worse. It aired against a rerun of an episode of Roots and still got totally clobbered. When you hear, oh, it's against an episode of Roots, the ratings juggernaut of the 70s, that totally makes sense. Oh, it was up against something everyone had seen already. Ouch. It bombed pretty bad, and so they did not order it to series. But I think it is actually interesting they tried to do things with special effects. They tried to do a lot of things that I think now it'd be more of a TV climate for, but they're definitely trying to experiment. I understand how they're trying to do it with the kind of doctor show thing and have some magic shit and stuff. It ends up kind of resembling Garth Marenghi, but if it was straight and super boring and not interesting. And that's the main problem. Most of the acting is fairly wooden. I will give credit to Jessica Walters. I think she's a great actress, not just because of Arrested Development, but she gets a lot of these things to work, even though most of the time she threatens people. It's just that they kind of get the heebie-jeebies that she's around, which is like, I don't know, is a power or just being creepy, but you know, whatever. They portray it as a power. Peter Hooton, who plays Doctor Strange, doesn't really do a good job most of the time when he's just the doctor part of Doctor Strange, I guess. When he's just being a doctor at the hospital and such, he isn't really that interesting. He's very wooden. Most of the people are just like flatly delivering their lines. It almost feels like they never really got into it until they're like shooting laser beams out of their eyes. And frankly, that woke me up a lot as an audience member, because a lot of this is very boring. It moves very slowly and quietly, and a lot of people talking, and you're like, oh my god, what the fuck? Like, please speed up and do something fun. And then they do, and you're like, oh, this is great. And then it goes back, and you're like, oh, okay. And then it goes back to the exciting stuff. And the special effects are neat. I like the music, which is by Paul Chikara, I think. Actually really cool for the time. It was more of a synth score, which was not as common. It would be a little more common in the 80s. This is right before that. And there are some interesting things about it. They even got John Mills, who is Haley Mills' father and an Oscar winner, to play the Sorcerer Supreme, who's going to be kind of his advisor throughout the show. They were going to do more comic book villains, and this was going to be more of kind of like a Doctor Strange comic book TV show, not like having Doctor Strange do like, you know, problem of the week things like the Incredible Hulk. And I like that idea, but I don't feel the passion in anything that isn't him actually being the Supreme Sorcerer parts. In any part that's not him being the Supreme Sorcerer, this is just so flat and dull. it can't really be funny. Peter Hooton doesn't seem to have any personality outside of those parts. It's like they spent way more time shooting any part with special effects, and it showed from both the acting and the technical side of it. Maybe it's because it was just so dull, and it reminded me of 70s shows that I would catch on TV. And I used to think when I was a kid, I was just being immature and thinking things were boring, and then you caught when you were older, and you're like, wow, this is actually really boring. I wasn't just being an immature kid. The director of this would go on to make something like Simon and Simon, which I also didn't like. So I don't know if he was necessarily the greatest person for this, but it also probably more highlights kind of bad 70s TV. It kind of gets into the mysticism of it. It tries to do Doctor Strange and fails pretty poorly, but it tried, which I think is commendable considering all the other CBS Marvel stuff. That it actually tried to do something different, I think is a tad interesting. And even the Doctor thing, you know, watching a 70s medical show isn't something I really have any interest in. I think a lot of people are going to overrate this and say, hey, it's something different than the Benedict Cumberbatch movie, and it's got this 70s thing, and it's like this TV movie thing and all this stuff. The thing is, there are like actually good 70s TV movies. In fact, there are really good 70s TV movies. This is not one of them. And acting like it is shows you have no taste whatsoever, because this is really bad. Like, it is super awful for most of its runtime. The parts where like he's going through the portal to go to another realm is amazing and awesome, and it's all the 70s weird sci-fi shows that I only got to see in the Sci-Fi Channel as a kid. I used to love like 70s, 60s, 80s sci-fi shows that would play when the Sci-Fi Channel wasn't just crappy original programmings and stuff. They would just play like syndicated old shows, and it reminded me of watching those, and I have pleasant memories of that, and I like that attitude with it. But it's kind of like original Star Trek. Like, the special effects are neat and nifty, and it's kind of a kitschy thing to watch, but they had stories to balance it out, to make it worthwhile, and why people still watch it to this day. And this TV movie does not have that at all. It doesn't seem to really understand how to transition the comic book onto the small screen. It's kind of interesting how they decided to compromise that with a medical show, but also there's scenes where like Jessica Walters and John Mills are talking to each other through Mind Link or something, and it just doesn't work in terms of shooting it for TV. There was a lot of times where I don't think they thought about how to get this to work as a whole TV movie. It just seems like a mishmash of ideas that really never came together, although kind of had the best intentions, and I at least respect that about this TV movie, that it actually did have good intentions behind it. It's just that they utterly failed if you actually watch this TV movie, and no, it really wasn't all that good. If you're going to rank the CBS things, I would probably put a little asterisk to say, hey, at least they tried, but other than the Incredible Hulk Bill Bixby show, I probably wouldn't watch any of them anyway, and I don't think it is able to have the one thing that the Bill Bixby Incredible Hulk had, which was fucking Bill Bixby and Lou Ferrigno, which are very charismatic actors and can carry me through all those things. And I like watching Bill Bixby and Lou Ferrigno. Peter Hooton's all right in some scenes, but for the most part, he's very wooden, and they just feel very phoned in. None of it feels very inspired. The acting isn't really that great, and it's overall a very boring watch. It's hard to even concentrate to come up with interesting theories about the adaptations of comic books and things. It was more interesting reading that everyone actually cared in this, because honestly, I was surprised after having watched it that any of these people kind of gave a crap, because you can't really see that at all on screen. It was kind of showing you how far we've come in comic book adaptations, but it doesn't really show you more than that. If you're a Doctor Strange fan and a completionist, I guess you'll come across this eventually, and if you do, I'm sorry. So if you have seen Doctor Strange and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.